Hello everyone, welcome back to another video. Today's topic is bonsai on a budget. So what are inexpensive ways to start the hobby of growing your own bonsai tree? As a person who is interested in growing your own tree, you probably already start to research a little bit, and then you have encountered trees that are being sold for thousands or tens of thousands of dollars that are very well established, grown over multiple years or decades. And then it might seem a little bit daunting on how to start this hobby and not already break the bank just by buying your first couple of trees and tools. So in this video, it is my goal to show you ways on how to buy trees, buy the tools that you need to take care of these trees, and in the end care for those trees in a way that is budget friendly and inexpensive. So let's start right away with the first big topic, and that's how do you buy a tree without breaking bank? You could go out right now into any specialized garden center specialized on bonsai trees and buy a tree for probably a couple of $100s. However, there is more inexpensive ways to go on with the task of getting your first tree. You can still go to normal garden centers, maybe even box stores or normal tree nurseries, and look for material that you yourself can turn into a tree over the next couple of months or years, depending on what tree you're actually getting. So what are maybe little things you should look at when you go into a garden center and look for a tree? Let's say you are interested to start with maybe an indoor bonsai, so let's take a little ficus tree for example. What are things you should look for? A first important thing, of course, is the trunk itself. The trunk is an extremely prominent feature on your future bonsai tree, so if the trunk is somewhat interesting, if it looks well established, if it gives the semblance of an old tree, that's already a very good base to start with. If the foliage looks healthy, the roots look healthy, there's no visible pests, then that already seems to be a good package to start with as a bonsai training tree. So that is one way of starting with a quite inexpensive tree. In those usual garden centers, you often find also commercially grown bonsai trees that are definitely also less expensive than a tree that has been cared for a couple of decades, for example. So you could even start with one of those little commercially grown starter trees. However, I do find the joy of starting with your own material, your own stock material, and turning it into a bonsai is a big part of actually the hobby of bonsai trees. So definitely I would recommend to get your hands dirty and really start with your own nursery stock. Another thing that I would also recommend, and which is quite budget friendly or very budget friendly actually, is taking propagations or taking cuttings from trees you already have in your home, or maybe from friends that allow you to propagate part of their trees. Propagation means you cut, for example, off a small branch, you root it either in soil or maybe in water, so you wait until roots are forming on this cutting, and then you plant it and you keep growing it until you are able to work on it and turn it into a nice looking bonsai tree. Of course, this is also more long term. We're talking normally here about a couple of years until you really have material that you can start working with to turn it into a bonsai. However, it is always nice when you look back on a tree then after a couple of years and you realize, hey, that is something I've grown myself from a propagation a couple of years ago, and here it now starts to look like an actual tree over the years. Another thing that is often recommended and is also somewhat budget friendly are seeds. However, I do not recommend this, especially if you start with bonsai, because here we really talk about multiple years until you have anything resembling a bonsai tree. So I would rather recommend the root over a garden center tree or maybe even a propagation, because it simply is faster. And I mean, when we start with a hobby such as bonsai, you want to get your hands dirty, you want to work on your trees, and with seeds you won't have the possibility to do that for a couple of years. So why not get a more established tree on which you can work, and maybe on the side you still try to get some seeds to germinate and to grow. Still better than if that is the only way you have to then work on a bonsai. So in summary, I would recommend going to normal garden centers, maybe in box stores, and propagating yourself for a quite inexpensive way of starting with your own bonsai tree. Moving on to the tools, and that is something that is extremely daunting for many people. The amount of tools available in the hobby of bonsai is overwhelming, to be honest. There is so many different shears you can use, ones for branches, for leaves, for roots, something for bigger branches, something as a concave cutter so you don't leave any stump on your tree. There's many specialized tools, and they all have their purpose and they all have the right to exist and be used. However, if you start with the hobby, you don't right away have to invest in all those specialized tools, because you can start quite easily with a good pair of garden shears, secateurs, and you can even use a normal household scissor in the beginning to prune your trees. So when it comes to the normal task of pruning, you can very inexpensively start with, as I said, garden shears and normal scissors. When it comes to wiring, you don't have to go to, again, a bonsai store or even a garden center and get the quite expensive aluminum wire that you can find normally there, specialized for wiring bonsai. You can simply check out a craft store, for example, and see there often they do also have copper wire or aluminum wire that is perfectly fine to also use for wiring on your tree. And when we talk about tools, we also have to talk about pots. As the pot is such an integral part of your tree, people tend to really splurge on those pots, or they feel like they have to splurge on these pots. However, especially again when you start to begin with a tree, and maybe it's not even yet a finalized bonsai, you don't have to buy the century-old bonsai pot that you found somewhere on your last trip in Japan. You can also here find less expensive alternatives. And one alternative I tend to use quite a lot is training pots. You can find those plastic training pots usually also in many garden centers. They are quite inexpensive. They still somewhat look nice. Of course, they don't look as nice as a handmade clay pot, for example. But especially for trees that are still in training, those training pots are very, very nice. If even that is too expensive for you, you can go really the DIY road and use old ice cream tubs, for example, and simply make holes for drainage in those plastic tubs and use that for bonsai. That is a possibility. In the end, it is a container. It just needs to be able to also release the water on the bottom, so you need to have drainage in there. Other than that, of course, you can use it also to grow your first trees in there. And speaking of DIY, you can make your own pots. Often what is used is quick drying cement varieties. Of course, only if you're able to do that, I would recommend to do so. You can make your own pots out of wood. I've seen that, also looking very nice, especially for training pots. There is different ways you can get a little bit more crafty when it also comes to the pots. And let's already come to the last topic, and that is the actual care for your tree. We talked about the tools for maintenance, but now let's really talk about the care. And with care, I mean simply the conditions you keep your tree in. Often you want to get the whole setup right away. You feel like you need to get a couple of growing lights, maybe even an automatic watering system if you're not there, a grow tent maybe even, but you can start also here low budget. Normally, talking again about indoor trees, because maybe you don't have any outdoor space for outdoor trees, you do have a windowsill where you can place your trees, where you get enough natural light to do perfectly fine. Will they grow as fast in winter as they would under grow light? Definitely not. But especially for your first trees, you can simply work with natural light. However, yes, growing lights is something sooner or later maybe think into investing, because it really does simply speed up the whole process of growing a tree. When it comes to growth tents, there is also cheaper versions than that. There's DIY options that I've seen that seem to work quite nicely. Because in the end, you just need a confined space where moisture and light can be managed by you. And that works normally also well by doing it yourself in some way. When it comes to care, of course, there's also the question of fertilizing. What I find is that liquid fertilizer especially is quite inexpensive, so I would simply still advise here that you go and buy liquid fertilizer. It normally keeps for many, many months until it really runs out. So that is normally an investment that is worth it. If you want to look into more organic ways of growing, making your own fertilizer based out of food scraps, for example, of course, do the research, go into there, look at it. If that is a possibility that you want to combine anyway with maybe limiting your waste of organic materials or the waste of food, why not do that and actually benefit from it by making your own fertilizer out of it. And what is also part of the care is taking care of pests. Here you again have the way of going out into a store and buying chemicals against pests, which normally are quite expensive. Or here again, you can look at natural remedies or simply remedies you already have in your household. What I find for many of the pests you normally find on your trees, be it scale or be it mealybugs or whatever, liquid dishwashing soap. So dishwashing soap mixed with water is usually taking care of most of the problem right away. So simply mix a drop of that liquid with some water in a spray bottle, spray your tree, let it soak in for maybe 10-15 minutes, and then you simply rinse the entire tree with water, and then normally you can really get ahead of any pest on your tree right easily and quite inexpensively again. So there you have it, a couple of ideas on how you can start with this bonsai hobby in quite an inexpensive way, be it which trees you actually start with, the tools you start with, and how you care for your trees. There is always an alternative to quite an expensive way, And over time, of course, if you feel you want to upgrade your tools, you want to upgrade your trees, you want to upgrade the setup you have for your care, go ahead and do so. It just shouldn't be a limiting factor to actually start with this hobby. Because in the end, the more accessible it is for everybody, the more people can enjoy it. And that's, I think, all that we're here for, to have hobbies that are accessible and that people can enjoy. And hopefully some of those tips make it easier for you to also enjoy this hobby of growing your own bonsai tree. If you have any other suggestions on how to find inexpensive alternatives for any of the things that I said right now, feel free to leave them in the comments. Let's get a little list going of tips that we can all benefit from. If you have any questions, also feel free to leave those in the comments. If you enjoyed this video and found these tips helpful, feel free to leave a like. And if you enjoy my channel, feel free to subscribe to it. Hopefully I will see you in the next video. Until then, take care.